We'll call the meeting to order. We did prayer this morning, so I need a mover to adopt that agenda. Shauna, declaration conflict of interest as it arises. Now I need a motion to go in camera. Danny? Oh, what? Okay. Okay, oops. I do apologize. I was looking at a different motion here. We don't need a motion for. Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this public briefing of the Standing Committee on Social Development. My name is Jane Wayallen Armstrong and I am MLA for Morphe Cleacher Region and Chair of the Standing Committee on Social Development. I will now ask members in the room to introduce themselves for the record, followed by those online. Thank you. We'll start to my left.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Danny McNeely, and I'm the MLA for the Sahtu region. Mussy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. George Nearsu, I'm MLA for the Mackenzie Delta.
Good afternoon. I'm Shauna Morgan, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Okay, now we will go to the online.
Good afternoon. My name is Cheryl Yakalaya. I'm the member for that.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Testart. I'm a member for Range Lake here in Yellowknife.
Thank you, members. Today we will receive a briefing on housing as a human right from Margaret Flynn with the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights. This briefing is part of this committee studies on how NWT legislation and policies can incorporate housing as a human right. Please note this meeting is being live streamed to the Assembly's social media channel. I would like to remind all members and witnesses to direct all questions and comments to myself as chair and to wait to be recognized before speaking to help us have a smooth meeting. I will now pass it to our presenter. Please introduce yourself and proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you today from Oakville, Ontario, on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and recognize that this land is being home and traditional territory to other Indigenous people since time immemorial. I'm very grateful to be living and working here. My name is Margaret Flynn. I've been a lawyer now for almost 20 years, and the focus of my legal work is on human rights and housing. I'm Director of Policy and Law Reform at the Canadian Centre of Housing Rights. CCHR is a nonprofit organization that's been working for around 35 years to advance the right to housing. At CCHR, we provide direct legal and education support to vulnerable renters. We conduct research into right to housing topics, We make policy recommendations around the right to housing, and we push for law reform to better realize the right to housing. Unfortunately, I've not had the opportunity to spend time in the Northwest Territories. And so I know that my submissions today will be limited by the fact that I am based in the South. I really appreciate your invitation to meet with you today. And I hope that the information I share can be useful to you. I'm happy to remain available for any follow-up questions you may have, both during and certainly also after this meeting today. So I hope it will be helpful for me to touch on three main issues today. First, I'll just speak briefly about the right to housing framework in general. Second, I'll discuss the purpose of the right to housing framework. And third, I'll share some particular recommendations that arise from our recent work here at CCHR. So first then to look at the right to housing framework. So all governments, and if I could ask for the next slide, please. Thank you so much. All governments have a duty to use maximum available resources to work towards progressively realizing the right to housing. They have to, within this framework, they have to work towards a reality where people have a safe and adequate place to live. And while they're doing this work, they should be triaging all the time. They should be prioritizing the groups who are most in need and directing maximum available resources there. They should act as quickly as possible, and they should always engage meaningfully with people who are precariously housed. Now, when governments are working to create and encourage more housing opportunities, they should be working towards housing that meets the factors you'll see here on the next slide. And again, and these factors, as I know you've discussed already in committee, are that the housing must be culturally adequate, must be affordable, must be secure in terms of its tenure, connected to adequate services, in a good location, habitable, so in good shape, well-maintained and accessible. And again, governments have to triage here. They have to prioritize people most in need. So they should look at the factors here that are a particular challenge for people in the region and prioritize those factors in the work that they do. And next slide, please. Now, the right to housing framework also means that housing should be offered in a dignified and non-discriminatory way. And it also means that there should be follow-through. So there should be ways for people to complain if they believe their government is not doing enough, and they should get help with those complaints. But even better, governments should think about removing the burden on vulnerable people to complain, and instead create systems where governments and housing providers are responsible for meeting certain targets. And where they have to report on those targets, regardless of whether people bring complaints forward or not. Now, next, just to move on towards applying the framework. So how can the Northwest Territories government actually use the right to housing framework? Well, it can use the right to housing framework to help analyze existing laws or policies or government approaches to determine where there's gaps and where changes might need to be made. And it can also look at how others have used the right to housing framework. How have others used it to bring about change, through things like community engagement, through things like legal challenges, and so on. Next slide, please. So, in conducting an analysis of its existing laws and its existing policies and approaches, or of proposed laws or policies, it can be really helpful for government to review these things side by side with a checklist that keeps right to housing principles top of mind. So asking questions like, was this law or policy policy or approach developed after meaningful engagement with the people most impacted? Was it developed after meaningful engagement with Indigenous nations and representatives? Does this law or policy or approach prioritize the needs of those most impacted? Does it promote safe and adequate housing? Does it promote housing that is affordable, secure, habitable, accessible, close to services, in an acceptable location, culturally appropriate? Does it treat people in a dignified and non-discriminatory way in sort of all the stages of the process, in all the steps that people need to take to access housing? Is it treating people in a dignified way? Does it offer a plan for monitoring and enforcement? And does it use maximum available resources for housing for the most vulnerable people? Next slide, please. So certainly government can do some work itself to self-reflect and to change its own laws and policies and approaches in consultation with the people most affected. But we've certainly seen in various jurisdictions that pressure can come from outside of government too. So sometimes pressure for change can come in different directions, right? Sometimes it's coming from communities, sometimes it's coming from other governments, sometimes it's through a legal challenge. And I think it can be really helpful for government to be aware that that pressure for change can come from all of these directions so that it can anticipate the needs, of course, of its constituents and also anticipate its legal vulnerabilities and its legal obligations and get to work as soon as possible to move forward on the right to housing. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate then, government can do some self-reflection along with consultation with affected communities. It can analyze its existing rental housing laws and policies, its existing shelter and transition home laws and policies, and it can also look to alternatives to affordable rentals, like, for example, home ownership programs, like I know you have been discussing in these deputations. Next slide, please. And when government is doing that self-reflective work, it can be helpful to remember some really key areas where government can get right to housing work done. So it can certainly work towards preserving existing affordable housing stock and developing new options. It can work on tightening up renter protections and enforcement of renter protections in existing laws like the Residential Tenancies Act and the Human Rights Code. It can ensure that people who are precariously housed, it can do everything it can to ensure that people who are precariously housed get free and easy access to people who can help them understand and enforce their legal rights. It should certainly do all of this in a consultative way through Indigenous and community partnerships. And it must do all of this with a mind to creating culturally supportive housing. Next slide, please. Now, we've discussed what government can do to move on right to housing, but we also know that effective pressure can come from other directions. So we know that communities can use right to housing language to call governments to account. We know that one level of government can also use right to housing language to call another level of government to account. And we know that individuals, groups, and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis nations and governments can also call on the federal housing advocate to investigate systemic housing problems, report on them, and make recommendations to the federal government about it. Next slide, please. Now, it's also possible that individuals or groups or governments can bring legal cases against a government or against a housing provider to argue that they are not respecting the right to housing, and by extension to argue that they have violated one of Canada's existing laws. So Canada's existing laws contain certain protections that relate very closely to the right to housing and can form the basis of a right to housing type complaint. So we know that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms says that governments have to respect people's right to life, liberty, and security of person. And we know that the Charter says that governments have to respect people's right to be free from discrimination. So there are times when somebody who's got a housing concern might be able to bring a complaint against government saying that it has violated the Charter. It has violated their right to life, liberty, or security of person, or their right to be free from discrimination discrimination by its actions in the housing environment. We know that the Northwest Territories Human Rights Code says that people have a right to have access to and enjoy housing in a way that's free from discrimination. So sometimes people might be able to bring a complaint with regard to sort of a right to housing concern. They can bring a complaint to the Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission. We know that the Northwest Territories Residential Tenancies Act says that people have a right to safe, well-maintained housing, have certain rights around evictions. So if people have right to housing concerns around habitability or around security of tenure, things like that, they might be able to bring a complaint to the Residential Tenancies Office. And we know that there are other safety and zoning laws and bylaws in the territory that people might be able to complain under. And so when bringing a complaint about a violation of one of these laws, certainly people can talk about the right to housing. They can talk about the rights that are spoken about in the National Housing Strategy Act and say, you know, not only have my rights under the Human Rights Code or under the Charter been violated, but this is also a violation of government's commitment to the right to housing. So these legal complaints can be made using these existing laws. Next slide, please. And really, this is just a reframing of that we have these legal protections at different levels of government that people can complain under. Next slide, please. Now, we have a recent example of the courts weighing in on the right to housing. In 2023, we saw courts in both Waterloo and Kingston, Ontario, grapple with what it means when municipalities evict people who are living in encampments. And those courts really took a right to housing approach and said, look, you cannot do that. You cannot evict people from an encampment when there are no truly accessible alternative housing options for them that meet their individual needs. And the court said that truly accessible accommodation alternatives would be accommodation that offer daytime sheltering, space for couples or families, space for pets, accommodation for people who use substances, and accommodation for people who need to be distanced from substances, storage space for belongings, safeguards for personal security, things like that. That's truly accommodating, accessible accommodation. And if those things are not present, then we do not have a true alternative to encampment residency. And so we see the courts there really grappling with the shortage of available housing and what it means, you know, if a municipality is evicting people from an encampment when there is no true alternative. So there we see sort of that legal grappling with the right to housing. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of some recommendations for renters' rights, I know that I know from Stark Truths that Lisa Ali-Kamek spoke to in a previous deputation. I know that it contains a culturally appropriate housing wish list. And so first and foremost, I defer to those 17 recommendations. I will take a few moments to share some recommendations that perhaps might be of some assistance to you that arise from some recent work that we here at CCHR have done around the federal government's request for input on a renter's Bill of Rights. So these recommendations do relate specifically to rental situations. And so these recommendations apply to people who are covered by the Northwest Territories Residential Tenancies Act. And just as there are some exclusions from the Act for people who live in, for example, subsidized public housing, so too some of these recommendations that I have may need to be adjusted a bit for people who live in subsidized public housing. But I'll just share a few of these recommendations for renters' rights. Next slide. Oh, sorry, you're there. I'm so sorry. Actually, I'm still on the affordability slide. Thank you. So in terms of affordability, we recommend that rent increases be allowed only by a certain guideline percentage amount each year, where that guideline amount is no more than a cost of living increase. So essentially here, this is a recommendation that the Residential Tenancies Act be amended to include this rule that rent increases can only be made by a certain guideline percentage per year. We further recommend that rent increases be controlled not just while a particular person is living in that unit, but between tenancies, so that landlords do not have the ability to sharply increase rent between tenancies. We recommend that above guideline increases be allowed only in extremely rare circumstances. They should require specific approval of the Northwest Territories Rental Office in a process that tenants can participate in, and they should require clear proof of landlord expense, and they should not exceed a maximum percentage. And we further recommend, because we have seen a problem with short-term rentals and throughout the country, but we further recommend that the Northwest Territories enact a primary residence requirement for short-term rentals. Next slide, please. With regard to security of tenure, we recommend that Northwest Territories make it clear in its Residential Tenancies Act that evictions are to be ordered as a last resort only, and only when there is simply no reasonable alternative. We have seen problems across the country of evictions that are not proportionate, where people are being evicted in a way, and there certainly were alternatives to that eviction, and of course that eviction having such a massive impact on that tenant's life. So we make a strong recommendation that evictions are to be ordered as a last resort only. We further recommend that there be strong protections for people facing gender-based violence. We heard from in Stark Truths, for example, about somebody being evicted after they called the RCMP about abuse they were facing. And this is the type of thing sort of that gives rise to this recommendation. We recommend that the Residential Tenancies Act contain language that clarifies that a person experiencing gender-based violence, experiencing domestic violence, should not be evicted for the actions of the perpetrator. And in situations where the perpetrator is evicted, that the person experiencing the gender-based violence, the person experiencing the domestic violence, should have an option to retain the tenancy, even if they are not named on the tenancy agreement. We also recommend that people experiencing gender-based violence or domestic violence be able to break their leases without penalty and with their privacy and confidentiality maintained. So again, this recommendation would be for an amendment to the Residential Tenancies Act. We further recommend continuing leases. So that means eliminating fixed term leases and creating a rule that all leases automatically continue until the tenant chooses to leave, or until the parties agree to end the lease, or until the housing provider follows a proper eviction process to evict the tenant. But otherwise, tenancies would continue. And we also recommend that tenants can continue their lease through renovations. And that also we recommend that occupants not named on a lease have an avenue to be able to stay on that lease. Certainly in situations, for example, where you have a parent who's named on the lease, and they have a child living with them. If the parent passes away, having an avenue for the child to stay on that lease. Next slide, please. With regard to habitability, we recommend that there be a clear right to timely repairs and maintenance, that the onus be on the housing provider to do repairs and not on the tenant to report the need. We recommend a clear right to essential services like drinking water, sanitation, heating, and cooling, and a quick and easily accessible way for tenants to get help if they are not receiving these essential services. We recommend that tenants have a clear right to housing resilient against the effects of climate change, that incorporates Indigenous and community knowledge, and an onus on housing providers to respect this right and to report on what they're doing to meet it. Next slide, please. With regard to the right to accessible and culturally adequate housing, I defer to the culturally appropriate housing wish list and Stark Truths, which of course lays out ways that more accessible and culturally adequate housing can be developed. Next slide, please. Again, with regard to equity and equality, I defer to those recommendations. Next slide, please. With regard to access to justice, We recommend a rental registry to promote transparency around how much housing providers are charging and to prevent big rent increases between tenancies. We recommend clear, accessible legal information and supports. We recommend a right to legal counsel for housing matters and complaints, especially in situations of, for example, eviction. We recommend a right to effective, timely, and procedurally fair dispute resolution for housing matters. We recommend effective, timely enforcement of rights, which recognizes the imbalance of power between landlords and tenants, which includes strong accountability and enforcement mechanisms, and which places the onus wherever possible on housing providers to prove that they are following the rules, instead of putting the onus on tenants to complain about violations of their rights. We recommend that systems be put in place to educate landlords about their obligations under the law. And we recommend that tenants have the freedom to organize and collectively bargain with housing providers if they wish to do so without facing a penalty. Okay, that brings me to the end of my slides. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and recognize Mr. Speaker. He's in the meeting in here with us. So, Mr. Speaker Thompson, welcome. Okay. And so now I will now ask members if they have any questions for the presenters. Okay, Ms. Morgan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I don't know where to look here. Thank you so much for your time today and your presentation. I wanted to follow up on something you said actually at the very end. You're advocating for rights for tenants to organize and collectively bargain without penalty. What would that right look like? And are there examples of tenants doing this, organizing and collectively bargaining with the landlord around rates or other conditions about where they live? And when it says without penalty, what would the penalties be? I just wonder if you could explain this idea more and if there's any real life examples.
Absolutely.
Miss,
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Flynn, you can begin now. Yeah.
I'm so sorry, Madam Chair. Yes, absolutely. So where this really arises is we certainly have seen examples where tenants, especially in a building, may want to gather together and raise a concern about, especially about a shared issue, say, for example, a shared maintenance issue in the building, or concerns about rent increases that are occurring across the building, things like that. And those tenants have individual leases with the housing provider. And so the housing provider may respond saying that they do not have to have discussions with any kind of group of tenants, that all discussions have to happen on a one-to-one basis. And so having some kind of language in the Residential Tenancies Act that says tenants, have an ability to assign, a representative to communicate with the housing provider on their behalf, specific language saying that this sort of, this can be designated or this can be assigned would make it clear that housing providers, would have to have those communications with the representative that the tenant chose. And, in terms of preventing sort of blowback from this or blowback for tenant organizing, the kinds of protections would look similar to the kinds of protections we see in labor laws that make it a specific offense to levy any kind of penalty against somebody for taking actions to organize other tenants in their building, things like that. In terms of specific examples from other jurisdictions, I would be really happy to do a little further work and get back to the committee with more specifics on that, if that's possible and if that's helpful. But at this point, I would say, it would look somewhat similar to the kind of language that we see in labor laws, just, allowing that designation and then also laying out, specific consequences if somebody were to face reprisal for taking actions to organize amongst themselves.
Thank you. When you do, you can send that information to our committee clerk. Yeah, Ms. Morgan, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, thank you for that. I would certainly be interested in seeing the examples or how that works in practice. You are also advocating for some kind of controls on rent. I would sort of characterize it as. So we've also heard concerns from especially smaller housing providers or smaller housing developers that a rent control mechanism in the north would just further push out smaller developers and further squeeze or reduce the supply of available housing at all, and then leave the market even sort of more controlled by, say, national REITs or publicly traded companies. Do you have any thoughts, or have you done any research on like possible dangers of rent control or unintended side effects or ways to mitigate that in a smaller housing market such as ours? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, again, there's definitely actually a wide range of literature that talks about, and a wide range of studies that talk about how typically this kind of rent control has not had the effect of quashing housing availability. That said, I'm not aware offhand of research that is specific to the Northwest Territories. And so again, I will, when I'm following up, I will see if I can do a little bit more digging and see if I can find something specific that might be helpful in this case. On the one thing that I would add, however, is that most of these models tend to attach to them an ability to seek an above guideline increase. So an above guideline increase where, a landlord makes a case, a housing provider makes a case that in their particular situation, they need to raise the rent by more than the guideline amount. So essentially, there's like the automatic ability to raise the rent by, whatever amount has been determined to be equivalent to something kind of akin to the cost of living, maybe 2.5% or something, tends to change from year to year as set by the government. So there's this automatic ability to increase the rent by that. But it doesn't mean that that's the only ability. There is an ability to seek a higher increase than that, but it's simply that it's got to receive approval. So the housing provider has to make out a case why in their particular situation they need to go higher than that. And so I think there are ways to customize that particular piece and even to think about how it can be particularly customized for, small landlords to address, some of the concerns that they may have. But I think, in this analysis, it's important to realize that typically there is that ability to seek, essentially permission to go higher than that amount. But just by default, there's a set amount.
Thank you. Now we will go to Mr. Nersu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your presentation. My questions is in regards to security of tenure and location, specifically unfair and or automatic evictions. This past year, the Supreme Court said that the scan legislation in the Yukon was unconstitutional. This government was, the government in Northwest Territories was trying to make similar legislations, and because of our some illegal activities within the public housing units. Do you have any feedback on how this legislation could work, or if it's going to work at all? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nersu. Ms. Flynn?
Thank you so much for the question. I know this is a really tough one. I know that that housing providers and government are trying to balance, on the one hand, tenants' right, to have quiet enjoyment of their units, as the right that they have under the Residential Tenancies Act on the one side, and also, housing providers' duty under the Residential Tenancies Act to take steps when one of their tenants is not getting quiet enjoyment. So I know that there's these duties on the one hand, but then there's the duties under the Human Rights Code on the other hand that say that a housing provider has to accommodate the needs of their tenants, and especially needs related to related to disability, related to mental health disabilities, related to addiction. So certainly from a human rights perspective, there's a need for housing providers to take a step back and say, in this case, do I need to do more to accommodate a tenant who may be acting in a certain way, in a way that's connected to disability, in a way that's connected to something protected by the Human Rights Code. And if that is coming into play, if the Human Rights Code is coming into play, the reality is it sort of takes precedence over the obligations of the Residential Tenancies Act. And so certainly any kind of a system has to ask the question, are there human rights issues at play here? Is there someone here with a need that connects to the Human Rights Code? Is there someone here with a need that connects to disability, whether that be mental health disabilities, whether that be addictions or any other kind of disability? And if there is a need there, that the accommodation of that need becomes paramount, and the housing provider is expected to accommodate that need to the point of undue hardship. So here, again, we have a situation where it's a very high standard under the Human Rights Code. And so there can't just be, housing provider cannot just say there's a perceived danger, there's a perceived safety risk. Under the human rights law, we see that there has to be a very clear, a very provable, a very documented, evidenced, serious safety concern in order to say that a housing provider cannot accommodate that person. So I think all of that is to say that if there's a program that does not take those human rights obligations into account, that does not take that duty to accommodate the needs of tenants who identify with Human Rights Code grounds, if it doesn't take that seriously, and if it doesn't say that all steps will be made to accommodate that person, and that right up to the point of undue hardship. So essentially, the housing provider will do everything they can to accommodate that person unless there's a very serious, clear, provable, documented safety issue. If there's any kind of a process that doesn't have that included as part of it, it's going to be highly vulnerable to challenge under human rights laws, under the Northwest Territories Human Rights Code, under the Charter. So that piece is sort of really, really important. Outside of that piece, if there's also, further questions of, really related questions of, what are the housing alternatives? I spoke a little bit about the encampment cases that were that went through in Ontario, and there too, municipal actions were vulnerable to challenge under the Charter. Because municipalities were evicting people from encampments when there was no viable alternative place for them to live. So another vulnerability, not only is it, did the housing provider do everything it could to accommodate to the point of undue hardship? Another question is, are there viable alternatives for this person to go to? And if there are not, it's starting to look a bit like those encampment cases where, a government is taking action to evict people from a place when there's no viable alternative. So all of that is to say, this type of process where somebody is evicted opens up a lot of human rights questions and potential human rights challenges.
Mr. Nursu, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I should clarify that the SCAN legislation that the government of the Northwest Territories is trying to propose is in regards to legal sale of alcohol and or drugs. I think these people are putting themselves in these situations, and it's getting pretty difficult to get around these without to even evict them. It's hard. It's a hard process. So it's just more of a clarity, but going back to access to services, I know in my community they have these homes that are over 50 years old, and I've asked that the local housing authority do maintenance during the summer, because you can't. It's cold to go under a unit to try thaw pipes out, but they're not doing it. I just came from Fort McPherson this past weekend, and there's a number of homes, 50-year-old homes, frozen because I don't know if it's due to funding or lack of staff or resources that they can't do this work in the summer. But if they do it in the summer, then they'll save on fuel, because I know in one unit they keep the furnace running like at full blast. You can't even sleep in there. It's so hot. That's just to keep the pipes from freezing. That's how bad the situation is, and these houses are 50 plus years old. So they're just using Band-Aid solutions and saying they have the right to services. But right now it's we're not getting. I don't believe those services are being done or kept. It's more of a comment than anything. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Flynn, do you want to comment on that as well, or?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it really does. It really does highlight a key issue that we run into with regard to maintenance, with regard to habitability. We hear about this in so many different sort of iterations, but the idea is the same in that maintenance is not happening, and people are living in unmaintained situations. Even if they complain, they have to wait a long time for the problem to be fixed, and sometimes these problems relate to deeply, critically important pieces of the rental building, relating to heating or water or things like that. It does lead me to think about what I spoke about a few times in the presentation, relating to where the onus is. Is the onus in this system is the responsibility in this system lying with the tenant, lying with the renter to make a complaint in order to get things moving? And in so many of our systems, that's the way it is, right? The only way things change is if a tenant raises a complaint. But of course, that can be so hard for so many reasons. It can be hard because it can be intimidating. It can be hard because it can just be a difficult process. It can be hard because they file their complaint and then they're waiting for ages and ages to get a response. It can be hard because there might be even some processing fees and things for making a complaint. It can be hard for so many reasons. And so I think wherever we can, if we can think about ways to move away from a system where the onus, where the responsibility is lying on the tenant or the renter, and putting that onus onto the housing provider. And there's different ways, and there's challenges with these other systems too. So I think we do have to be thoughtful about them. But in some cases, it's a system where there are just regular mandated inspections of buildings, or where there are licensing systems where in order to rent out, you have to, as a housing provider, you have to get a license. And in order to get a license, you have to fulfill certain requirements, like proving that you've done certain maintenance, things like that. And I know that there can be concerns with those systems because they can be seen as adding an additional barrier to the creation of housing, or they can, they can be seen to sometimes create systems where costs or burdens are passed on to tenants and things like that. So there are cautions, I think, to think about in sort of a licensing type model. And with the committee's consent, I do have a document on licensing that I can share with you all that highlights some of those pitfalls. But it can be something to consider. Is there a way to creatively push off the burden from the renter, from the tenant, onto the housing provider, so that the housing provider has to proactively show that they've taken certain maintenance steps? And especially if we know that there are certain common problems that happen year over year, is there a way to put that responsibility onto proactive responsibility onto the housing provider? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Well, since nobody is going on next, so I do have a question. Well, further to what Mr. Nerisu just said, in NWT, the main housing providers are Government of the Northwest Territories Housing NWT, and I believe we have like close to 2,000 rental unit that's provided by the housing in many of the small communities. So I think it all comes down to local housing authority are not funded adequately to keep up with the maintenance, and there's the challenges too as well, with the supplies. So there is a lot of challenges, especially as for the isolated remote communities. So I think it's something that we will be, so what do we do in this situations? Like, what would you do? Like, is it just only in the Northwest Territories that we have these issues? I know Nunavut is in the same situation as us, but other, southern Canada, are there other groups going through the same situation as us? Maybe if you can, tell us more about that. How, thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. We have a massive crisis across the board, a shortage of truly affordable housing. And I fully agree with you that it's so difficult to move on a number of other issues until we have the supply, until we have the stock that we need. An issue that we have, and I'm not sure how this applies in your situation, an issue that we have in a number of southern communities is actually losing a lot of existing affordable housing stock. It's actually a big part of the problem is that there's a massive and continuous loss of affordable stock. We had sort of, the creation of affordable housing up to sort of the middle of the 1980s or so, and then just a sort of a steady decline of housing after that point. So there's a massive sort of bleed of affordable housing, a massive loss of affordable housing, which is part of the problem, paired with a need to create additional units on top of that. So there is that kind of two-pronged concern in many of the southern communities. And I'm not sure in Northwest Territories if it's that sort of double-pronged problem as well, or more on the side of just needing additional supply. But so there are certain steps that we see advocates trying to push for to stop the bleed, to stop the loss of the existing affordable housing stock. And these programs or incentives to try to retain that housing. But then also just, a general advocacy push towards, all levels of government to push for more funding towards affordable housing. And, there really it's where we're looking at the advocacy piece. We're looking at, groups that are trying to come together and push for more directed funding for affordable housing options. We've seen, certain legal challenges that tried to push for it as well. The Tanajaja case, for example, about 10 years ago, where there was an argument that governments had to do more to create, more housing options and to address concerns around homelessness. What the court at that time found, unfortunately, was that they felt that argument was too close to sort of trying to impose a positive obligation on government to take new and fresh steps. And so that legal challenge was not successful. But really, I think where the movement is more on the advocacy, the community sort of advocacy front.
Thank you. For the record, we do have 2,730 public units in the Northwest Territories, and 2,427 are occupied in the Northwest Territories, and that's a public housing unit. Another one, too, is that you did mention in your report, individual groups and First Nation, they can call on federal government housing advocate to investigate systemic housing problems. So I know in the past that we did Auditor General report. I just want to ask you if you can elaborate more on that, that federal housing advocate to investigate. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly. So any group or organization can approach the federal housing advocate with a description of a particular housing problem that they are facing, and ask for the federal housing advocate to take some type of action on it. We at CCHR have actually prepared a sort of a kit for organizations who want to put together a submission to the federal housing advocate. So again, with your permission, I would be very happy to share that with the committee.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the information. And it does seem like there's don't have nothing for a second set of questions. So thank you for the presentation, Ms. Flynn. And thank you for joining us today. And so this concludes our public briefing on housing as a human right. So thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.